Good evening and welcome along. It's a year since we had any crowds in football. We've not had the noise unless we choose to hear it on the television if we press the right button. We've not had the chatter that we hear in the pubs as we roll out of stadiums, and many fans have been isolated from the fortnightly ritual of going to the match. Some clubs have even been isolated simply from playing the game just based on their status. But this is it. Welcome to Create the Space. 12 months from the Terraces. This is the third Create the Space talk. My name is Emil Franchi. I'm delighted to be hosting this for the National Football Museum. And as a fan, I am desperate to look at that green mass as I embark upon the stairs at St James's Park. But you can forgive me for the moment that I'm not too keen to get back into that stadium to watch some of the performances of my team. I am joined tonight by my guests. We've got Kevin Miles, Chief Executive of the Football Supporters Association. We've got Saiqa Naz, who is the Chair for the British Association for Behavioural and Cognitive... I've written it down on psychotherapy. There we go. Therapist and writer, of course, Saiqa. And we've got the author of Get Your Head in the Game, Dominic Stevenson. Yeah, got the book there, straight in, get the promo. And we've also got Professor Andy Smith from Edge Hill University, and also representing Everton in the communities tackling the Blues. We were going to have Amber Keegan-Stubbs tonight, so I apologise if anyone's turned up expecting Amber. You can leave now if you wish. But she actually had a reverse PE note. She's actually got football training tonight for Crystal Palace women. She's been recently awarded Player of the Match the other day, so I believe that the celebrity that she is now, she's getting so many other communications that we just had to take a second place. But it's worth looking at the articles that Amber Keegan-Stubbs has written. She's been very open about her struggles with mental health, and we do wish her luck in the match that she's got. So we should begin, shouldn't we? And I'm just going to do loads of questions, guys, and we're just going to chat about this and see what the impact has been like for the last 12 months. I hope everyone is good. Kev, I'll come to you first. I know you've spoken widely about this. I know the FSA are involved, but has this been the most damaging year for football clubs and fans alike?
Well, it's been devastating, I think, on lots of levels. I mean, apart from anything else, you've got to remember football fans aren't different from anybody else in the community in the sense that we've all got bereavements to deal with, we've all had ill health to deal with, we have everything else that's going on in the rest of society. And it's been a devastating year from that point of view. I think a lot of people have really struggled to orientate themselves in that context. Anyway, when you add into the mix that a lot of your social life, your passion and your identity even revolves around something that's not happening anymore, that's something that you can't do anymore, I think that adds in an extra pressure as well. Now, I like to think at some stage there might be some positives that come out of that as well. In the sense that I've heard people in the course of the last couple of days at the highest level of football. I was at a conference yesterday of the European leagues, and they were saying there, if this year's taught us anything, it's how important football fans are to the game. And hopefully there'll be some positives that come out of that in that sort of sense as well. But I think the impact of this year, it's been weird, and it's been really difficult to deal with for a lot of people.
Yeah, and Dominic, obviously we know about your book, and you've spoken to so many fans. I know you've got various accounts just sprinkled throughout it, and you can see how much the game does mean to people. But how important do you think going to the match is in terms of fans' mental health? Win, lose or draw, what's it like taking that out of people's lives?
And it just provides a sense of community for so many people that they have a whole week that revolves around going to a game, and they meet people that they otherwise may not meet. They have an opportunity to do something potentially on their own or with a loved one. I went to Hillsborough for years with my dad, and it was absolutely the highlight of my week. Going there, we'd drive down together, go to a match together, go for a cup of tea at my grand's, and sit there until the traffic went, and then go home and talk about the match all the way home. And it just provides so much, and have that ripped away on top of the sort of trauma that we're all collectively feeling, that 140,000 people have sadly lost their lives in the last year due to COVID. And that's impacted on each and every one of us.
Yeah, and like I say, we would be in the pub sometimes chatting about the match, but fans, I think more so over the last year, have flocked to Twitter as almost this new community, if you like. And Saiqa, you have been front and centre on that, kind of coming at this from a non-football fan's background, but you've been involved with Neville Southall's account doing your Ask Saiqa hashtag, and you're engaging with fans all the time. So how did you link up together, you and Neville?
I think it was in his early days. First, I'd just like to say thank you for inviting me to this space. I've got a little story to share. So working in mental health, I remember once saying to my manager, let's go to the local football club. Men are underrepresented in the service. Let's go there. I'll work a Saturday. And he laughed. Yeah, he laughed on my face, and I felt really embarrassed at the time. And looking back now, I'm thinking, actually, that was exactly the right thing we should have been doing. With Neville's account, I started to take over to talk about mental health around Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. But actually then I realised perhaps that wasn't the space to talk about the communities. I do sometimes bring in those conversations, but it's sort of evolved into what it is now. We're almost 2 years down the line. And what's beautiful about that space is we're bringing in people. Neville draws in people from across different clubs and they are genuinely very supportive of each other. They provide each other with peer support, and I tend to just try and hold that space. I sometimes share videos, share a bit of information about mental health. Sometimes I speak to people one-to-one and they end up getting support. So it's just turned out to be this really nice space, and it keeps us going. I think just having the space away from politics, a space away from maybe some of the hardships that people are experiencing in life, and just a bit of a break once a week.
Yeah, it's weird how football hashtags almost have their own little planets, if you like. I know myself from being on the Newcastle one all the time. We've obviously had a lot going on that hashtag, but everyone seems in it together. I mean, we've been through the absolute mire with takeover rumours and everything else, and now we sit and watch Steve Bruce every week. But it is strange. And Andy, you've got your own area, obviously a representative of Everton in the community, and the Tackling the Blues campaign. Obviously, we've seen that fans have been affected in so many ways over the last 12 months. What sort of things does your initiative do?
Well, the programme really has been running for the last 5 years or so. And first off, it was to support children and young people in local schools throughout Merseyside and Lancashire. And since then, it's really grown to support other people who support children and young people, so parents, but other people in the local communities. And one of the big learnings for us is just how central, as Kev mentioned earlier, football clubs are to local communities, particularly in areas of significant deprivation, which you'll be familiar with in parts of the northeast and certainly in the northwest. And one of the key responses of the programme really was how we could support the mental health of people in those local communities, from children and young people all the way through to parents, grandparents, and others who go to games, really. And that's really proved particularly important, of course, over the course of the last year or so, where clearly many of the relationships we're having right now are virtual ones. And that hasn't necessarily replaced the day-to-day connections that people get from going to games, because as Dominic mentioned previously, it's much more around the structure and the events, really, of going to games that people miss, and the socialisation and that the face-to-face contact is important. It can't be replaced by the virtual environment, but the virtual environment certainly has proved to be important in supporting people's mental health at what has been clearly a very challenging time for everyone.
Yeah, it's amazing some of the stuff that you see, and it's good that people are finding these things so useful. Kev, I guess you get a bit of a wide spread of these initiatives that you see from members. What other kind of initiatives have you seen that have really risen up during this last year?
Well, it's actually quite heartening to see how many of them there are up and down the country. I mean, the whole point about the FSA and about fan groups at local level as well is it's about people realise that they're stronger together and they get organised in order to provide a collective voice. and they help each other, whether it's representing fans to the club about ticket prices or whatever else it might be. And in times like this, there's a number of those groups who've, you've not got match day issues to deal with. You can't complain about the stewarding when you're sat at home and you're settee watching on the telly. But what you can do is you can organise an initiative that looks out for other people, is aware, people are aware of what they're going through. I think they're not on their own in doing that, and they put things together. And there's been, up and down the country, there's been initiatives by groups reaching out to their own members, just a bit of looking after their own colleagues on the committee and people in their own membership, or undertaking various different initiatives, reaching out in the communities and that sort of thing. And what we've done recently is we've pulled that together. I mean, it's not just supporters groups by any means. There are a lot of football clubs and the football leagues and others deserve a lot of credit for what they're doing in this space. But we pulled together a national campaign, a little hashtag, I think you call it, you young people, under the hashtag of Terrace Talk. And we've done that in connection with Mind and in partnership with the EFL. And to try to pull some stuff together so people can share that experience, share what works and what's helped, share some good ideas, some signposting to the right sort of places for expert help, a little bit of education and training for fan groups that want to get involved in that sort of stuff. And there are literally too many to name check and to list. But if you're interested, go on our website and we try and give credit for all the ones we hear about. And it's impressive the amount of voluntary time and effort that has gone into reaching out and helping each other. It's the essence of a supporters organisation and a movement, really.
Yeah, I have to say, I've seen it through many clubs. I know Sunderland fans are currently raising money because they've got to a cup final and they're trying to make up the difference of what would be lost. And food banks are getting so much support simply because the footfall's been lost on match days. And it's amazing. So football fans really are some of the most generous in the world. And I guess I just want to quickly move off the fans very quickly. Dominic, I know in your book you've done some case studies on players' mental health. I guess it's quite strange at the top level to not have anyone there. Do you think that players might be impacted by a lack of crowds? And I mean, especially the teams who aren't permitted to play at the minute in the lower leagues. I know that Amber would have spoken a bit about the inability to play being in the Women's League, but how much do you think it impacts the players?
I mean, you've just got to look at the top level. You've got teams like Liverpool, teams like Sheffield United, who had really good seasons last year, and they spoke very much of the 12th person, as it were, and that's gone, and you see the impact on the results. And then you go down to lower levels in the men's game, and you go to even the top levels in the women's game, and they've had their lifeblood stripped away. That people grew up and spent years giving their everything to be there in front of fans to play. And I think for the men's game in the lower league, it's going to have a huge impact, because when people talk about footballers, and they often talk about people who earn a lot, people who shouldn't necessarily have worries, but you go down anywhere below the championship and you've got people who, although they're earning a fair whack, like I'd happily take a League One wage, but they are on a year-long contract now. And if they're knocking on even 27, 28, chances are they may not even get that next year. And then the impact on the income is going to mean that squads are smaller, that clubs are relying on loans from bigger clubs. And then you sort of look across the women's game, which has done so much over the last few years and really propelled itself into a major force in sport. And they've had everything taken away from them. That you've got top players, world-class players coming and gracing the pitches of the UK, and they're playing in front of no one, and they're very short careers, and all that work that was done by the Lionesses, by the Scotland team at last World Cup, is being slowly eroded away, not through lack of effort on the players' part or the club's part, but through the fact that no one can see what they're doing, because the media hasn't, as of yet, caught up with how amazing their games are, how brilliant the football is. And because of that lack of representation, they've not got the following. And programs like Football Focus do a reasonable job, but a lot more could still be done to support them.
Yeah, well, hopefully this will be the final time. We hope everyone can get back eventually. Saiqa, I was just going to ask, with regards to the stigma attached between mental health and football, do you think it's still there? Do you think it's going away? Do you think it's getting worse?
I think it's still there, but I think from the perspective that I come from, we have to look at some of the structural issues that prevent men from getting the help that they'd like to get. And over the last sort of 18, 20 months, I've engaged with hundreds of men, whereas the mental health services are saying, oh, it's stigma, they're hard to reach, it's toxic masculinity. And now I'm going, hang on, I'm doing this once a week and I'm engaging with more men than your services are probably doing in a year. So you need to really rethink your strategies and the way you develop and design your services. And I think sometimes the mental health professions are really bad at laying the blame within men. And I'm saying, actually, we need to have a more rounded discussion and an approach, because I think it's really unfair to keep blaming men and masculinity and not actually doing our bit. So that's kind of the perspective that I come with. So, yeah, the stigma is there. The stigma is there in all communities. But the way services might do outreach work or designed their care might just be tailored for some people and not all.
Yeah, and do you think there's any way in which CBT can help? I know that's kind of your area. So do you think there's ways in which that can help people, or if anyone is watching today, how that can help them?
Absolutely. So CBT is just cognitive behavior therapy. We look at thoughts, feelings and behaviors in its simplest sort of form. And if people want to know more about CBT, you can actually go on babcp.com. I don't know if somebody can share the link to the website. There's a public page for the public. We've got podcasts on there, a bit more information around what CBT is. And at some point I will get around to organising the videos I've been loading on Neville's account. They're just a bit all over, but I tend to bring in my clinical experience when I'm sharing the videos, but I'm weaving it in a more generic sort of way and less clinical kind of ways. But the information is based on my experiences of working with people clinically.
Yeah, we have got the link in there, actually, so it's in there for you, babcp.com, if anyone wants to have a look at that.
Absolutely. And we've got far more to do, and I think we need to take responsibility as clinicians that we need to be doing more, and this is probably why I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, get that message out there. That's what we want. And no, great that you can as well. I'm going to check that out too. Just to say that at the end, we will have some time for questions. So if you want to submit one, I believe it's wherever I am on the screen. It might be below someone else, but yeah, it's down there, and pop that in and we'll try and get to it. Andy, I know that you do a lot of work with this at the university and stuff, but the relationship between physical and mental health, do you see this connection?
Yeah, and I think that's been important, and one of the kind of key standout points of the lockdown period actually has been the emphasis on enabling people to go for their daily exercise, walk, or whatever it might be of people's choosing throughout the pandemic, really, right from the most severest of lockdowns to now. And I think that has been important because it's been one of the key antidotes, or one of the key ways in which people have used activity to benefit their mental health. And we've known for a while now that physical activity or exercise can be just as effective as antidepressants for mild to moderate depression, for example. And that can be really important if we can enable people to engage in activity. This isn't necessarily activity which means that people have to be out of breath all the time, or to be in pain or excessively sweating. This is activity like taking the dog for a walk, or going for a walk, or meeting up with people to do things in a relatively moderate way. And that's really important, I think, as we come out of gradually the current lockdown, that we don't lose the connection between physical and mental health. Because typically when people talk about health, we often automatically think of this as physical health. And actually one of the stigmas that you associated earlier, and that you asked Saiqa around mental health, is really that false separation between physical and mental health. They're inextricably linked together, and you have to recognise that that a change in one can be associated with a change in another, and that actually we need to broaden our understanding of health, so that when we have these types of conversations, we're not necessarily having to focus solely on mental health. We have a mental health day, for example, but we don't have physical health days. That tells you something about the dominance of physical health when we're dealing with these conversations. And I think that's true for all population groups, particularly with fan groups, but with others beyond sport. And just kind of one point on the stigma idea and the programs. A lot of the programs that we've been involved with, clearly with Everton and other clubs and in other sports, in fact, is that one way you can get fans or other people locally engaged in mental health work linked to sport is by using sporting analogies, or using sporting language and sports settings like stadia to attract local community groups, particularly men, to engage in those types of services. And that's really been quite successful, I'm sure, across lots of the foundations that Kev mentioned as well. One of the successes is that if you can position mental health support in a way that essentially declinicalizes a lot of the activities and positions them in local communities, in grounds or in facilities linked to clubs, then you can attract substantial numbers of fans to those programs and to support them where they need it most.
Yeah, we're getting some nice little mentions, by the way, just in the chat at the minute. We've got Jay Deacon saying Everton do some amazing work in our community. They've shown support to my men's mental health group, Talk Hub. I'm not sure if you're aware of that one, Andy, the one that you've come across. We've also got Liz Barton-Jones mentioning the Foundation of Light, Sunderland, who I mentioned before, Newcastle United Foundation, who are working together. I've seen this one as well. I know a lot of people working on it with Be a Game Changer, which you can see on the stands as well. And it's good to have those in the stands, I guess. I think most clubs have gone down that route of having at least one little bit represented in there. And Saiqa mentioned for you as well from John Lewis, saying I would never have reached out for help or advice if it wasn't for you using Neville's account. So the good work is being recognised. Dominic, I just wanted to quickly come back just with that kind of physical and mental health connection. Again, in your book, you talk about how players are sidelined through injury and the mental feeling when you are on the sidelines. I mean, what did you get from players who spoke to you about that?
Well, I mean, they felt it was tough, and I think criticism often thrown at players who suffer from injury is that maybe they're happy to sit on the sideline and take the wage and just let everyone else get on with it. But that's really just not true. Like, I spoke to Sam Hutchinson, who is an absolute hero of mine for his work around mental health advocacy, as well as his, at times, incredibly brutal playing style. And he...
Oh, we might have lost him there. Taking an injury there. We'll get a substitution and we'll get Kev on very quickly. You there, Dominic? Sorry, we just lost you briefly there.
Sorry, am I back?
Yeah, you're back now. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, sorry. Sam Hutchinson, do anything to be on that pitch. And he suffered a lot when he's had managers in the past doubt his injuries. And then, in turn, they've doubted his mental health challenges. And I think that clubs at the very top level, I don't think challenges around mental health for players. And then the further down the leagues you go and into the women's game, they don't have the resources to tackle those mental health challenges. So at the very top, I think they ignore them for the riches. The further down you go, they ignore them through necessity. And it goes back to that thing about them being on one-year contracts. And Sam Hutchinson, for example, is on a deal until the end of the season at Sheffield Wednesday. So do the club have to invest in his long-term mental health support or not? Or do they just beat him like a horse on the final furlong of a race and try and get what they can out before they send him to the knacker's yard? And I think fans have a responsibility to take time to understand. And I think through all the initiatives we've heard about, I hope that fan groups are becoming more understanding, so that I hope there's a time when a footballer can come forward and say, I'm not feeling great today, I'm going to take the time out. Buffon did it 15, 20 years ago, or 50 years ago, he's been playing that long. But there's one match where he said to his goalkeeper coach before the match, I'm feeling too anxious, I'm feeling too upset to play today. I can't do it. And so they put in the sub-goalkeeper. He took a few weeks off. And since then, he's done all right as a player. And that's what happens when you support people.
Yeah, well, Buffon's a great example. Like you said, he's managed to have this illustrious career for however long. And Kev, we keep touching on going lower down the leagues. We've said about the suspension of women's football. Lower league teams. I watched a documentary about teams and fans being owning these clubs. It was brilliant, by the way. It was called Ours. If anyone wants to watch it, I would highly recommend it. But these lower league teams, what can be done to support these teams that maybe the teams in the top leagues just don't hear about? Because they've got fans just as much as our teams have fans in the Premier League. But, you know, your average team around the corner, they just haven't been able to. They keep getting called off. Their leagues are getting decided on points expected. What can be done?
Well, I think the first thing is to recognise that the relationship between a fan and their club at the Premier League level is very different from what it can be, you know, further down the pyramid. I mean, I've got 2 season tickets. I've got one for Newcastle United and one for Blythe Spartans. And it's a very different relationship when you go to Blythe Spartans. A lot of those clubs, there is a very fine line between fan and club official, because half of the club officials and people doing the jobs are volunteers who pay to go through the gate and then, you know, carry out various different tasks in the club. And it becomes an even bigger part of people's lives because there's a responsibility goes with it there as well. And there's loads of clubs who would not get through their existence and their fixtures and their league program if it wasn't for the input of fans, not just paying the money to go through the gate and drinking at the bar, but actually carrying out volunteer services like stewarding or, you know, whatever else is cleaning up on the basic level, but even club administration and all the washing the kit and all the stuff like that, so often carried out by volunteers. And becomes a massive part of people's life, but it also a really rewarding one as well. They feel where people really feel that they're coming together. There's a community feel about it. They're all in the same boat. They're all pulling the same direction. And to have that taken away from them over the course of the last year can be have an enormous impact. Now, a lot of those clubs as well, it's a big political battle around the finances and making sure that they survive, because we look at football and we see football now, there is more money in the game than there ever has been before. But the way that it's distributed doesn't mean that everybody in football is wealthy. And there are a lot of those clubs we've had to fight to get, first of all, distribution of money from the Premier League down the pyramid through, you know, to the Championship and the League One and League Two, because the government would take no responsibility for those clubs. And a lot of clubs in League One and League Two, I mean, these are clubs who are really live day to day, week to week in terms of their own financial survival. They need that money. And I mean, there's an interesting political argument around that. There isn't any other industry I can think of where the government said the successful companies in that industry have to look after the less successful companies. Nobody said that Tesco's had to look after the corner shop, or that the Bond film franchise had to look after the local theatre or anything like that. But then below that level, we've had to campaign to get government to give financial support to those clubs, and it's the only thing that's kept them going. And it's been devastating, because a lot of those clubs, if you don't have fans through the gate, there's no broadcast revenues to rely on or fall back on. If you go and have fans through the gate, you cannot survive. You can't pay your players. You can't keep them coming together. So they've had to abandon seasons. They've had to, basically mothball themselves until things come back, and that has a big effect on whole communities.
Well, I was going to ask, actually, could you tell us a little bit more about Sustain the Game and the campaign that the FSA did with that?
I could talk for hours about Sustain the Game and the campaign we do around that if you're not careful. But it's the essence of that whole campaign is precisely that point, that there is a lot of money in the game, but football has an importance to people, and importance to community way beyond the economic. It's the central identity. It's part of what communities identify as. It's part of what holds communities together. I mean, I actually did a meeting for new Tory MPs who'd been, without necessarily suspecting themselves, accidentally got elected to Parliament representing northern towns. And I did a little meeting for them about football. And I did a little bit of research, and you Google some of the constituencies that they were coming from. And we were talking about people here who had never thought in a million years that they would get elected. I met one of them. He'd visited his constituency 3 times, and the third one was for his acceptance to become the MP. He'd never been there before. But a lot of these places, when you Google them, if you Google a town name, the first thing that comes up in a Google search is the football club. You Google Blythe Spartans comes up. There's so many other northern towns, and they were asking questions. Well, what's this football all about then? Why is it so important to be? And it's an identifier. It's a thing that holds communities together. And we had to really make the case about, you are investing in a football club. You are doing more than just keeping some players paid. You are keeping almost like the soul of a community together. And that's really important. And we want to see that, football, the game of football, regulated in a way so that it's not prone to asset strippers and chancers at the lower level, and it's not, completely dominated by the financial interest of the billionaires who are trying to make it, an elite sport at the top level. There's a huge finance driver from them. Football is so much more important. It's not like any other business because of the position it has in society, and it cannot be afford to be left to the free market in that sense, in the same way as maybe other parts of the economy can. Government even has a responsibility to step in and do something about this.
Yeah, and of course, Blythe Spartans will be going for the FA Cup again, Kev. So, there's every hope.
Well, the frightening thing is that Blythe Spartans made their name in that cup run when they got to the 5th round of the FA Cup. Do you know that was in 1977? When you start doing the maths about how many years ago that was, 44 years ago? I was there.
My dad was there.
It makes you realise, but the fact it's still talked about 44 years later shows what the significance of things like that can have in people's consciousness, doesn't it?
Yeah, I was actually just thinking today, in particular, the teams that were in the early stages of the FA Cup that were Marine, for example, who were performing miracles in the FA Cup. No fans were there to see it. It's these are the memories, and you want to see them happen again. So let's hope that these teams come back to have that magic of the cup. Saiqa, I just wanted to come back to you and talk about your Twitter stuff again. We've seen from people in there just saying how beneficial it is, but you must get people who know Neville from his time as a footballer, therefore a bit more of an older generation. And as we know from Neville's Twitter account, he does like to learn. He likes to progress. He likes to educate himself. Do you think that having footballers do that from the age group of people who perhaps don't know so much about changes and things like that, do you think it's beneficial for them to have these communities to really bring them up to speed and perhaps educate them more on things that are going on in the world?
Absolutely, because we're living in more of a digital technology is really important, isn't it? Everything's social media, and I do wonder what's going to happen when lockdown is restricted. I don't think we'll ever get back to how things were because people are reliant on technology, and so there is this thing about digital exclusion, for example, and we need to really think about how do we create those spaces to give people the confidence to come on Twitter, to actually use Zoom and other forms of social media and technology. Otherwise, they will be disadvantaged, because I think this is something that the clubs really need to keep an eye on to be inclusive. Actually, you need to think about who are your members, what are their needs. We're thinking about people with learning disabilities. Somebody shared a wonderful article that their son had written to their MP in Grimsby about having anxiety and wanted to go back because apart from school, the only place he was going to, sorry, I think you might have lost me. The only place he was going to apart from school was the football club. And these are the sort of issues that it needs to have a more of a nuanced perspective. But I think Neville, he's just so incredible. I didn't know much about him. I actually learned through the fans about him because they educate me about what Neville was about and what he does. And And the way he just brings people together is fantastic. But I know there's people who are, we might consider to be older people, 65 plus. I'm sure they're on Twitter. I can't always see people's faces because of their profiles, so it's just a bit blind sometimes with the communication.
Yeah, I'm mainly up there with Neville simply because of the video clip of Michael Owen beating a 13-year-old boy in a shootout. So that's one of those classic internet clips. If anyone's not seen it, it's wonderful, and Neville is brilliant on that. So yeah, Andy, this is a bit of a broad question, but are you seeing enough change? Are you seeing enough from clubs to help fans, or do you still think that maybe more can be done?
Well, I think it's interesting the point. I think it was in one of the questions actually, or the comments in the chat around should the Premier League and the EFL be doing more to support clubs. One of our students of ours did some work with us last year actually on football fans' mental health. A survey that between May and June, and we got over 1,100 fans replying to that. And one of the questions that we asked them was around does the club have responsibility for their mental health, and some broader questions around that. Around 37% said they did. It was much higher for things like gambling, which we know indirectly is connected to mental health. Now, that may reflect a particular perception of what mental health is compared to gambling. But I think any conversations around mental health cannot be undertaken without the concerns around gambling being taken into account, and just how common betting is as a match day experience, not just at the ground, but in digital context as well. It's very easy, of course, to become quite dependent on gambling and engage in problematic gambling simply through your mobile phone. So I think that the broader question around mental health does need to take into account things like gambling, but also provision of things like alcohol. We talked about that sense of community, and it's interesting here, this argument around obviously alcohol and the community and the sense of occasion that fans get in a positive sense from attending games. Of course, in some instances that can be part of the problem as well. So I think we need to have that kind of more nuanced discussion, as Saiqa said, more generally around mental health in football as a whole, I guess, which is particularly important. But I think what is clear is that, certainly from our own experience, when fans do come to programmes, they're often, certainly in my own experience, they're often the last chance resort for some of them. We've worked on a number of men's health programmes where men have actually presented to the programme suicidal because they haven't been able to access services, or if they have accessed services, they haven't been presented in the way that supports men. So in many cases, and as Kev alluded to earlier, a lot of these programs can in some cases be life-saving. And actually we shouldn't underestimate the significance of those. So I think on a broad front, we have to look not just at the professional level, or what the club's responsibility to the professional game is, but also what is the responsibility of the clubs to their local communities and the connection between those, because it extends beyond the gates of the ground, and it extends beyond the seats and the TV, because actually the vast majority of those people who attend games do so for a whole range of reasons, and it's not just a Saturday, Sunday, or whenever it is that it's on the TV. It's actually day to day living in those communities where around the grounds where lives can be lost, but where lives can flourish as well, and that needs to be taken into account, I think.
Dominic,
one of the sorry.
Go for it, Kev. Yeah,
I was going to say, it's perhaps one of the ironies of what's come out of this whole COVID situation is that we've started to see some football clubs taking initiatives which in normal circumstances they might never have done, but because we've realised that there's something different going on here, that there's a particular crisis, they're starting to do so. And I've had some cracking anecdotes of 2 or 3 people where clubs have actually had players or old players, club legends as they call them, phoning fans, particularly older fans, and saying, reminiscing with them about the good old days and all this, reaching out in a way that they wouldn't necessarily have done in a normal season. I've had a couple of examples of fans who've told some of their absolute idols to get lost or perhaps a slightly different form of words, because they were convinced it was their mates winding them up when they phoned them up and said, I am such and such a club legend, I'm just phoning to see how you are. But there's maybe a little bit of an opportunity here as well, some beginnings of some good practice that we can really build on that might never have happened had it not been for the extreme difficulties of isolation that COVID's forced on us.
Certainly in the work that we do with Everton, Emil, there's a great initiative called the Blue Family Initiative, which has engaged over 46,000 individuals now since COVID started, and there's been real commitment across the club. It's involved people like Carlo Ancelotti, lots of the players who have engaged with and reached out to people in vulnerable situations across communities. And there's lots of chronic isolation, lots of loneliness, not just among older populations, but among younger populations as well. And actually that has helped that kind of almost a social movement. And hopefully that's what some of the good that hopefully will come out of this is that we actually start treating this more as a social movement, not just a football issue. This is about community regeneration, development, and supporting a better future, really. I mean, we hear from the phrases "build back better." There's lots of queries about what that actually means, but actually what is absolutely clear now is that we don't want to go back to normal, because normal wasn't great in the first place. There was huge inequalities across the country that was not great for mental health. There was huge inequalities in the game, and actually going forward, what we need is a new future, I guess, that begins to address those inequalities, and that actually puts the people who make football run at the centre of everything that we do, and that is the communities, because without those communities, it's been laid clear, particularly even among the more financially secure clubs, they are to a large extent dependent on the fans, perhaps with the exclusion of those at the highest level that obtain significant funds from TV. They are still vulnerable, and actually even beyond those, the actual experience clearly is generated by the fans, and that's what we have to recenter our attention on, I think.
Yeah, cheers, Andy. That's brilliant. So, Dominic, I was going to say, just on Andy's point there, in terms of the new normal, if you like, do you see fans maybe being positioned in a higher regard by clubs after this? Do you think that something massive will change?
I mean, I think tonight and the whole conversation around this issue has been very much what are fans missing out. But I would like to take a moment just to think about elderly fans, disabled fans, fans from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds, LGBTQIA plus fans who may not have been able to access stadiums or may have felt unwelcome at stadiums before. And although obviously there's been huge challenges, mental health challenges that people have discussed this evening around not going to stadiums, I think COVID has forced football clubs to take the initiative, and not just football clubs, but local sports journalists as well. The staff at the Sheffield Star, staff at the Athletic, for example, have gone to enormous lengths to run quizzes, to run sort of like events online where everyone can join in and take part. And for the first time, football fandom seems a bit more equitable than it was before. And I can't wait until people are back in stadiums, but I don't want to lose all we've gained. And I think as well that football has taken a huge financial hit, with the exception of probably the top 6 clubs in the men's game in England. And what clubs I think have to remember as well is there's people like me, like I was born in Sheffield, grew up in Grimsby, went to games until I was 19 and then moved to London to university, and I now live in Edinburgh. I can go to maybe 2 or 3 games a year when I'm visiting family. And yet this year, I felt more engaged with my club, which has almost caused conflict with other fans online, that I felt really engaged, that there's been more content, more activities to take part in, more ways for me to access the club that I love. And so I've been really excited at some points to see all that's out there. But then you've got fans who live within a driving distance or walking distance who are really suffering from missing out on that match day experience. And I just hope, as was said, that normal wasn't good enough. Normal excluded people. Normal made sure that someone couldn't walk into a football ground holding their partner's hand if they were a same-sex couple. In my book, I spoke to a footballer who's trans, who doesn't go to the club that she supports anymore because she feels unsafe, unwelcome, like she could come to physical or emotional harm by doing so. Is that how we want our game to be when we get back to whatever this new normal will be? Or, as everyone tonight has said so eloquently, do we demand better? Do we demand that football serves fans better?
Yeah, I really like that angle. Dominic, thank you very much for bringing that up. It's certainly something that I hadn't written down, so just goes to show it's one of those things that you might forget about, I guess. Kev, I'll just come to you briefly, just on the back of what Dominic was talking about. Do you see a major change happening in terms of the stuff that both Andy, Dominic were kind of speaking about in terms of the new normal?
I hope so. I don't think you can take anything for granted, and I think that's partly of our experience. Sometimes you get a high watermark and things look really good for a while, but it doesn't mean it lasts without work and without continued pressure and that sort of thing. And I think what we have to do is to take all of these new examples of good practice and best practice and then really fight to make them part of the furniture, to make them part of the permanent scenario. But you can't take that for granted. I think there's a real danger that things go back to normal the way they were. And I mean, particularly on these issues of mental health. Mental health issues existed a long time before COVID. COVID had brought them to the surface and it's highlighted them, and there's a lot more conversation around it, and that's very healthy. But I don't want we have to guard against the idea that was the COVID, as the vaccine comes in against COVID, that restrictions on people's movement and mixing and socializing sort of go away, that we think, oh, well, the mental health problems are solved. What COVID has done is it shone a light on a pre-existing problem, and it's also given us examples of what can be done, and some new examples of what can be done to help to tackle it. But we've got to make sure that some of these things get so firmly nailed to the walls while we've got the opportunity that they don't, disappear afterwards. And I mean, there's lots of the things that we're talking about. I mean, we would love, as a supporters organisation, that sudden realization of how important fans are, the scales have dropped from the eyes of some people. When you're not there, they've suddenly missed you. We got to try and make sure that understanding and awareness of how important fans are to the game, that persists even when we are back and we're paying the money over through over the turnstiles again. You can't take it for granted, though. It's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of repeats of events like this, and keep going with it. But I mean, that's what I was saying right at the very beginning. I was optimistic that through all of this adversity that we come through, there's enough of really positive things coming through that we can make permanent, that we can cling on to afterwards. And that's part of the process of making sure that the future that we return to is a lot better than the pre-existing.
Yeah, let's keep everything crossed, like I say, just for this to be the last time as well, but also a new way forward. I'd like to get into some of the questions that we've got from our people in the chat who've sat very patiently through all of us. And I'll come to the first one here from Samadi. This question is, does sport overall neglect mental health? I'm in the US and a star basketball player for my home team, had dramatic public admission of struggles. He's well supported, but what of the millions of non-pros? Saiqa, if you'd like to take that one.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm sensing here, there's a divide. I've just been thinking about some of the themes that have been emerging as you've been talking. There seems to be a divide between the larger clubs and the smaller clubs, but they're also, I think the fans could be quite critical in helping get that equitable balance. And I just remember, the whole shenanigans with Bury Football Club when it had to be closed. Mm-hmm. So I'm originally from Rochdale, so Bury's next door, and they held a session for mental health, and I went down just to show my support, not knowing much about football. And I spoke to an elderly gentleman. And then soon after that, I think there was something around Newcastle and somebody from the Middle East wanting to take over the club. I think. And again, I'm not from a football background, but I was just thinking that is really bad.
You're doing it to me
They
again.
don't care about the local people. Sorry for the re-traumatizing you.
It's
But
okay.
I
It's
just
still
remember
ongoing.
thinking from a mental health perspective, I was thinking, what do you know about football, actually? Because this is about people's lives and livelihoods. So I think there needs to be an honest conversation about the divide and thinking about what are some of the themes that are coming out, how are people being disadvantaged. Last night, somebody was sharing that they don't have digital photograph ID and they needed that to get I think there's some limited number of tickets that the football club was selling and you needed photo ID, and they didn't have photo ID because it's not cheap to get a passport for some people. And with COVID hitting men, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, I'm just kind of sharing some of the thoughts I've had.
It's
But
all
with
good.
COVID hitting men, affecting men disproportionately, well, actually, the football clubs need to think about how are they going to accommodate that when people can't afford tickets, because there's risk of isolation here, isn't there? So some people probably find their way back to the stadium, some people won't. How do you bring everybody along with you? Yeah, sorry, I just totally did not answer your question.
It kind of did come in two parts. So I guess that we've kind of covered the whole does sport neglect mental health. There was the second part, which was quite interesting, saying that there was a star basketball player that's well supported in the US, but what about the millions of non-pros who are out there? I mean, we kind of went into that with Dominic's thing, but I don't know if you want to quickly delve back into it.
I mean, this is, I guess, the bigger players, they have that privilege of then, financial security and the privilege, don't they, that the smaller players don't have from smaller clubs. So actually, and you've seen this with COVID, people who are key workers, frontline workers on low wages struggle to isolate because they've got bills to pay. They don't have money sat in the bank that they can rely on. So again, thinking about actually, it's not an even sort of playing field at the moment at all. So the rich people, can speak up a bit more, knowing if there are repercussions, actually, they'll be okay somewhat. And they have that privilege. And it's thinking about how do those people share that space and advocate for smaller clubs and people on less wage.
Yeah, and I mean, even if we look further down, we've got Sunday League, we've got pub teams, we've got so much of this community spirit of just having something different to do. It's massive the way that football just trickles down. There's a very well voted question here, so I think we should tackle it. Hattie has got in touch. He's a big fan of your book, Dominic. We've been getting great reviews in the comments there. Andy, I'd like to come to you on this one once I've got through it. Mental health is often talked about in isolation from other structural issues like poverty, but often the two are very interconnected. Given that football has a largely working class fan base, how do the panelists think that issues of poverty can impact on mental health within fan communities?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, and we shouldn't see discussions of mental health in isolation from structural issues like poverty, but also other structural issues like structural racism. We've talked earlier around sexism and so on. And a lot of those linked causes of inequality are among the principal causes of mental illness in all groups. It's very clearly connected to social class, and what we see is that the causes of mental illness and other health problems become much more common the lower you go down the social gradient really in society, and the more working class communities that we see in football. We've talked about many of them already. Many of those communities are characterised by significant deprivation and inequality, and they're some of the underlying structural as well as individual concerns that impact on mental health. So it's not surprising that we're having these conversations, but actually a lot of the community work that we've talked about is so important, because those deprived communities are the ones where we're more likely to see high rates of mental illness of various kinds. So actually, that's one of the critical supports that you need in those communities to engage people who do experience a lot of mental illness. So we do get an inverted curve, often called the inverse care law. Those that need support usually access it the least. And what we've seen in COVID already is that has exposed not only the inequalities in football, but the inequalities in communities in which it's played. And that's one of going to be the major challenges in terms of recovering through COVID, through the next 2 to 3 years, and it's certainly something that we're looking to do with at the university together with Everton. We've committed for the next 3 years to look at how we support mental health across the Liverpool City region, because things are only just starting. We may have seen the immediate fallout of COVID, but what we now will likely see going forward, as we've seen in every other kind of economic recession or pandemic, is major challenges to mental health, particularly as it relates to employment and unemployment. And we can't take our eye off that ball. And that is likely to get much worse before it gets any better.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andy, and thank you for the question there too. Sam has asked, because we were briefly talking on it, probably got time for just 2 more questions before we go. Dominic, I would like to ask you about this one, actually, just saying he'd be interested to know what the panel thinks about footballers' lives in early retirement. Is there enough support in place for a career change, perhaps, after dedicating their whole lives to training and playing?
I mean, I think it sort of goes back to the thing about big clubs, small clubs. That I spoke to Nick Cox at Manchester United, who runs their academy, and the things they put in place are world class. Like, they have mental health provision, educational provision at every level, which puts them in amazing stead for the future. And then the further you go down, people can't afford it. And I think there's a fantastic podcast called Under the Cosh, hosted by John Parkin and Chris Brown. And they talk about this issue a lot, that ultimately I think the PFA do a lot to support players, whether that be with retraining or mental health support. But ultimately, every year, there's hundreds of players who retire at all levels. And there's only so many coaching jobs, so many commentary jobs. And I think as well, they probably provide the right provisions for one or the other, career or mental health. But you've got to think, a lot of the lads who are retiring now, I mean, God forbid they're just a bit younger than me, and they've been in academies since they were 5, 6 years old. Football is all they've ever known. You're overnight, everything they've known throughout their whole life has been taken away from them. And I don't think the right provision for that is there. But I don't think there's a lack of provision. I just don't think there's the right provision.
Yeah. And we'll quickly, one for you, Kev. I'm going to try and merge 2 questions together here, which is quite ambitious, but it's what we're going to do when the time's tight. It's basically based around what Lee's saying that Premier League rules state that the clubs must provide a fans forum platform in which they communicate with fans. Should the Premier League and the league introduce similar legislation in relation to mental health support provision for fans and players alike?
But whether it's best done by the implementation of a rule or not is maybe a separate question. I mean, what we find with the structured dialogue that exists in the rules, it doesn't actually deliver anything or guarantee anything in terms of the quality of what goes on. It becomes a bit of a tick box exercise for some of the clubs. Yeah, we've done it. They don't put a lot of thought in it. It doesn't mean anything. It's just something that now, because it's in the rule, has to be done. Now, you could argue that's better than nothing, but there's no substitute for a real commitment to involving fans in getting the opinions of fans and really engaging supporters because you think they're important to your football club. Now, I'd suspect it's the same with mental health provision. If it requires a rule or something to get some sort of insistence that they do something to address this area, you might get in a lot of places something that's better than nothing. But there's no real substitute for actually having enlightened people in football clubs who realise the impact and the power that football can have and the enormous positive work that can be done. And it's got to be said, there's a lot of clubs do a lot of really good work in this area. A lot of the club foundations and trusts and this sort of thing, they do phenomenal work. And when you look at, when you look at some of them, I can't remember the terminology. I'm not an expert in this area, but they have this index that they use to measure the impact in financial terms of the pounds spent in the various different charitable areas that they do, and the return that is got on that sort of investment through a charitable foundation linked to a football club is enormous when you compare it to many other people trying to do stuff in the same way. So some of those foundations and stuff, some of the work the club does is already very, very good. But it usually happens because you've got individuals who are convinced about the importance of it and can make the case for it, that have seen what the impact of football can be. Now, a rule might be able to underpin that, but there's no substitute for the conviction of people, the dedication of people, and the realization of what the impact can be. And that's where you get the best practice coming in. I think it pays dividends.
Yeah, I'm going to come back just briefly. I mean, just very quickly, Chris Bruce was asking, do you think that clubs will have more fans on the board now, perhaps?
Well, I'd like to think so. You'd like to think that people realise the importance of fans and their input in this sort of thing. But even a fan on the board, it can be a poison chalice for even for the people concerned. It's not necessarily a panacea. Yeah. And thanks for Liz Barton-Jones for telling me and reminding me what I should have been saying, that it's called social return on investment.
It is.
I knew there was a proper term for it.
Yeah, we'll get Liz in briefly just for the end bit. Andy's put in as well just there about the Hub of Hope for anyone wanting to signpost people to local mental health services. There's plenty going on in this chat. It's probably more beneficial than what I'm saying, to be honest. I just want to get one last question in, just because this came in quite late, and it's from Matt Butler saying, "Thank you for this fascinating talk here as a Chester fan, but also as a psychiatrist. What are the panelists' views on what mental health practitioners could do to try and access more of these sorts of people through football?" Saiqa, I guess this is kind of going into a little bit of your field, but have you got anything to say for that?
Yeah, we need to take responsibility as clinicians and do outreach work. And I'm very challenging in my organisation. I challenge the chief exec, the directors. I'm challenging on Twitter. Because if you don't challenge, nothing changes. And you have to take the soft approach, the kind approach. But sometimes I was just thinking about what you were saying, Kevin, that actually sometimes we need to demand it. Because if you don't ask, we don't get. And the funding's been there in mental health services, a substantial amount of funding. Why is it that we're still having this conversation, actually? And why are therapists not working with enough men, for example? So we need to be getting offices in football stadiums, borrowing one of their boardrooms, doing workshops, bringing people together. We've got online things, so actually, bring people together, we'll deliver workshops. So there are ways now that we need to be thinking about how we engage with people. But ultimately, I can take responsibility for myself and hopefully do more of this. And I think that's a good place to start, because it's a learning experience, and then you can take that back into the profession. But it seems like you've got the same issues that we have in mental health. Generally, as a system, mental health, lack of representation of diverse people on, senior leadership, in co-production. And I think things, whilst there's an opportunity here, is why don't you set some sort of framework and set the standards that you want to set with fans and actually get the buy-in from clubs? That might be one way around it.
That's certainly something we've done, Emil, at Everton by having a GP on site in the local community hub. You get many more people wanting to access GP in a non-stigmatized, non-clinical setting, where we pick up not just mental health, but for physical health services. And we've certainly seen that in some of the work that we do also in rugby league. So it's certainly one way that you can engage in that by connecting those mental health services in clinical settings into the local communities, and indeed into the community spaces held by professional clubs.
Yeah, I mean, we're a female-dominated profession, and sometimes I think, okay, is it that we need to be reaching out? And I have given career advice to men who probably aren't from psychology backgrounds or don't have psychology degrees, and thinking about how do we actually bring you into the profession, and will that help actually if people start to see more men as therapists? Will that encourage them to seek help? And when we produce materials, do you see yourselves represented on the leaflets and the pamphlets? Not just on Mental Health Awareness Week or Mental Health Awareness Day. It really winds me up that all year everyone's quiet, and all of a sudden certain causes are highlighted once or twice a year. And it needs to be consistent messaging, I think.
Yeah, thank you, guys. Well, I believe we're going over here, so I'll probably have to end the questions there and just say once again a massive thank you to our brilliant panel tonight who've answered every single question so well. First of all, Kev from the Football Supporters Association. Kevin, I hope we get back soon, and maybe I'll run into you at Blythe sometime.
Do you really?
Hey, it's nice to have a local accent sometimes. It's just nice to speak to people. As well as that, Dominic, thank you very much. If people do want to find out a bit more about the players' perspective, playing staff's perspective, and a bit more about the fans, I can recommend the book, Dominic. So there we go. There it is. Straight in there. It's very good, and there's been some good reviews in there as well. Andy, good luck with everything as well. Continuing the work with Tackling the Blues and everything from that, and Saiqa as well. We'll see you on Neville's account at some point again, I'm sure. Absolutely, and good luck getting into the grounds, because I think it's something definitely that needs to happen, and football clubs should work hand in hand with that. Thank you very much. And this is there's going to be more talks from the National Football Museum if you'd like to check it out. It's all on their Twitter. And thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's been great.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.